The smell hits you first. Coffee percolating on the kitchen counter. That rich aroma mixing with the scent of wet wool mittens drying on the radiator. Then you hear it, the steady hum of the CBC announcer's voice drifting from the living room, and suddenly you're 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of your childhood home. If any of that makes something stir deep in your chest, you already understand what we're about to explore together. Before we step all the way back, this is Canadian Yesterdays. If those little details feel familiar, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and sharing one of your own memories in the comments, so we can keep building this archive of old Canada together, one story at a time. This isn't just about remembering the past. This is about feeling what it was like to grow up in Canada, when the pace of life moved differently, when your neighbors knew not just your name but your family's story, when winter seemed to stretch on forever, and somehow that felt exactly right. Today we're stepping back into the everyday moments that shaped a generation of Canadians, the small rituals and simple pleasures that defined life from the 1950s through the 1980s. Picture this. You wake up on a Tuesday morning in 1962. Your bedroom's still dark, but there's something that pulls you from sleep. The gentle clink of glass bottles being set down on the front porch. The low rumble of a truck engine idling in the crisp morning air. The soft thud of an insulated box closing shut. Your mother's voice calling from the kitchen, asking you to grab the milk before it freezes solid. You slip out of bed, your bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor, and pad to the front door in your flannel pajamas. The milk bottles stand there like little soldiers, their glass surfaces fogged with condensation that will turn to ice if you wait too long. In winter, which seems to last from October through April, the cream at the top pushes the cardboard cap up into a perfect frozen tower. You gather those bottles carefully, feeling their weight and the shock of cold glass against your palms, then hurry back inside before your toes go completely numb. The milkman wasn't just delivering dairy products. He was part of the fabric of your neighborhood. He knew which families preferred whole milk and which needed skim. He'd leave extra butter on Fridays because he knew Mrs. Thompson next door was hosting her bridge club. He'd wave through your kitchen window as he loaded up his truck, and sometimes he'd chat with your mother about the weather or ask after your father's job at the plant. This wasn't commerce as we know it today. This was community, woven into the simple act of getting fresh milk to your breakfast table. When evening rolled around, especially on Saturday nights, the entire country seemed to move in synchronization. At 8 o'clock, sharp, families from St. John's to Victoria would settle into their living rooms for hockey night in Canada. The opening theme would blast through tiny television speakers, that bold, brassy fanfare that announced something bigger than entertainment was about to begin. Your father claimed his spot on the couch, the same cushion every single week, worn soft from years of Saturday nights. Your mother might be darning socks or folding laundry nearby, half watching the screen but fully listening to Foster Hewitt's voice, painting pictures of the action on ice. You and your siblings, sprawled on the carpet, close enough to the television that your parents would periodically tell you to back up before you ruined your eyes. The sound of skates carving ice came through that little speaker like music, the crack of stick against puck, the roar of 16,000 fans packed into Maple Leaf Gardens or the Montreal Forum. When the Leafs scored, your house erupted in cheers. When they missed an easy shot, your father would groan and shake his head. But, win or lose, there was always next Saturday, always another chance to gather around that flickering screen and be part of something larger than yourselves. Hockey Night in Canada wasn't just a television program. It was the thread that stitched the entire country together, coast to coast to coast. No matter where you lived, no matter what your family did for work, no matter whether your grandfather spoke English or French or Ukrainian, on Saturday nights you were all Canadian together. No streaming services existed to fragment your viewing choices. No recording devices let you watch at your convenience. You experienced this moment live with millions of other Canadians, or you missed it entirely. As autumn painted the maple leaves crimson and gold, another ritual would begin in households across the country. The arrival of the Eaton's Catalogue. Thick as a telephone book, heavy with possibility, it landed on your doorstep like a promise wrapped in glossy pages. For children growing up in those decades, that catalog represented pure magic, a window into worlds of toys and clothes and gadgets you couldn't find in your local stores. You'd claim your spot at the kitchen table and flip through those pages for hours, folding down corners to mark the things that caught your eye. The chemistry sets with their mysterious bottles and tubes. The dolls with real hair you could brush and style. The electric train sets that could transform your basement into a miniature landscape. The hockey equipment that might turn you into the next Jean Beliveau. Sometimes you'd circle items in pencil, just to make absolutely certain that Santa Claus or your parents understood exactly which model you wanted. If you lived in rural Canada, far from the department stores of Toronto or Montreal, that catalog wasn't just convenient shopping, it was essential. You'd fill out the order forms with careful handwriting, seal them in envelopes, and mail them off into the void. Then came the waiting, weeks sometimes, until that precious package finally arrived at the post office or the railway station. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but it was also part of the joy. When you finally tore open that brown paper wrapping, it felt like Christmas morning, regardless of the season. Eaton's wasn't just a store, it was a Canadian institution, a name that carried weight and trust from one generation to the next. When you ordered from Eaton's, you knew what you were getting would be exactly as advertised. Built to last, worth the wait. The catalog didn't just sell products. It sold dreams, possibilities, the notion that with patience and planning, wonderful things could be yours. Summer days in those decades followed a rhythm that seems almost impossible to imagine now. After breakfast, you'd head outside with your friends, maybe grab your bicycle from the garage, maybe tuck a baseball glove under your arm, and you'd simply disappear into the neighborhood. No cell phones existed to track your location. No scheduled activities filled every hour. No parents hovered nearby with sunscreen and safety equipment. You just went out and played. The street became your hockey rink with makeshift nets that you'd move aside whenever a car needed to pass. The woods behind your subdivision turned into frontier territory where you could build forts and stage elaborate adventures. The corner store, just a few blocks away, beckoned with the promise of penny candy and ice-cold bottles of pop if you had a quarter jingling in your pocket. Your parents didn't worry because the entire neighborhood was looking out for you in ways that felt natural and unforced. Mrs. Patterson across the street would call you over if you were being too loud near her flower garden. Mr. LeBlanc would offer to fix your bicycle chain if it slipped off while you were riding. The older kids on the block made sure the younger ones didn't wander too far or get into real trouble. Everyone knew everyone else, not just by name but by family history, by which church they attended, by where their fathers worked. The only rule was simple and absolute. Be home when the streetlights came on. You'd spend the entire day ranging through your territory, but as soon as you saw that first amber light flicker to life at dusk, you'd pedal or run toward home as fast as your legs could carry you. Dirt under your fingernails, grass stains on your knees, sweat on your forehead, and happiness radiating from every pore. This wasn't freedom as a luxury or a reward for good behavior. This was simply childhood as it was meant to be lived. Communication in those days required intention and effort in ways that shaped how families interacted with each other and the wider world. There was one telephone in your house, maybe two if your family was particularly well off, and it was attached to the kitchen wall with the cord so long you could stretch it around the corner if you desperately needed a moment of privacy, which you never really got, because someone was always within earshot, always listening to half of your conversation and trying to piece together the other half. When that phone rang, the entire household would freeze. Who could be calling? Was it for you? Was something wrong? Was it good news or bad news? You'd lift that heavy black receiver, feel its weight in your hand, and if the call was for your sister, you'd shout her name through the house until she came running. If it was for you, you'd settle onto the linoleum floor and twist that spiral cord around your finger while you talked about nothing and everything with your best friend. Long-distance calls were events, expensive and reserved for emergencies or major occasions. You didn't just pick up the phone to chat with your cousin in Vancouver or your grandmother in Halifax. Those conversations required planning, budgeting, a reason that justified the cost. Instead, you wrote letters, real letters, on paper, with envelopes and stamps, letters that took days to arrive and weeks to be answered. Saturday mornings held a magic all their own, a ritual that began before the sun came up and your parents stirred in their bedroom. You'd wake early, earlier than you ever managed on school days, and tiptoe to the living room in your pajamas and bare feet. The house was still quiet, wrapped in that peaceful hush that only comes in the early morning hours. The television was yours alone. You'd turn it on and keep the volume low, waiting for the programming to begin. If you woke up too early, before the cartoon started, all you'd see was the test pattern, that colorful geometric design with its steady electronic hum. You'd sit there watching it, patient as a monk, knowing that eventually the station would come to life and your Saturday morning entertainment would begin. The Bugs Bunny show, the Flintstones, the Jetsons, all flickering across the screen in glorious black and white or early color, depending on what kind of television your family owned. You'd sit cross-legged on the carpet with a bowl of cereal in your lap, probably cornflakes or Cheerios swimming in that thick, rich milk the milkman had delivered yesterday. No cable television existed to offer hundreds of choices. No streaming services let you watch whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted it. If you missed your favorite cartoon, you missed it. Period. And when the cartoon block ended around noon, that was it. The television went back to being boring adult programming. So you went back outside to play? There was something almost sacred about those Saturday morning hours, something that belonged entirely to childhood. The ritual of earning that special time, of sitting in the glow of the television screen with your siblings. No arguments about what to watch because there was only one thing on anyway, just togetherness and anticipation and the simple pleasure of cartoons before the day officially began. Every neighborhood had its corner store, usually a small shop that had been there forever, run by someone who knew every family within a 6-block radius. Mr. Patel, Mrs. Newman, Old Joe, who'd been behind that counter since before you were born. They knew your name and your parents' names, and probably your grandparents' names too. They knew what you liked to buy, and how much allowance money you typically had jingling in your pocket. You'd walk to the corner store with a few coins, maybe a nickel or a dime, and stand in front of the candy counter like you were making the most important decision of your young life. Licorice whips, jawbreakers, fizzy bottles, Mary Janes, those little wax bottles filled with colored sugar water that you'd bite open and drain in one gulp. Best of all was the penny candy, where you could get 5 pieces for a nickel and feel like royalty. The shopkeeper would wait patiently while you pointed and counted, studying your options with the intensity of a stockbroker. They'd scoop your selections into a little paper bag, sometimes throwing in an extra piece if they were feeling generous, and you'd leave with your treasure, already chewing on something sweet before you hit the door. Sometimes you'd buy a bottle of pop, real glass with a deposit that you'd return next time for a few cents credit. Sometimes a pack of baseball cards with that flat piece of gum inside that tasted like cardboard, but you chewed it anyway because it came with your cards. The corner store wasn't just about commerce. It was about learning to count money, make choices, interact with adults outside your family. It was part of the rhythm of your week, a destination you could reach on your own, a place where every transaction came with a conversation and a smile. Then came 1967, and everything changed. Expo 67 wasn't just a World's Fair happening in Montreal. It was the moment when Canada stood up and announced to the world that we had arrived, that we mattered, that we had something unique and valuable to contribute to the global conversation. Families saved for months to make the trip to Montreal. You'd pile into the station wagon with your parents and siblings, drive for hours across highways that seemed to stretch forever, and when you finally arrived at the site, it felt like stepping directly into the future. The geodesic dome of the American Pavilion rose against the sky, like something from a science fiction movie. Habitat 67's apartment blocks were stacked like giant building blocks, each unit unique, yet part of a harmonious whole. You'd walk through pavilion after pavilion, wide-eyed and amazed at what human creativity and imagination could accomplish. You'd try foods you'd never tasted, see technologies you couldn't have imagined, hear languages you didn't understand but somehow felt connected to anyway. And everywhere you looked, the maple leaf was flying proudly, Canadians smiling and celebrating, the entire country buzzing with optimism and national pride. Expo 67 planted something deep in the consciousness of every Canadian child who experienced it. A sense that we were part of something bigger than our individual communities, that Canada wasn't just a polite, quiet country that apologized too much. We were bold, creative, forward-thinking people capable of hosting the world and impressing everyone who came to visit. As the 1970s rolled in, the rhythms of daily life began shifting in subtle but significant ways. The milk bottles disappeared from front porches, replaced by plastic jugs from the supermarket. Party line telephones gave way to private lines, then to push-button phones that seemed incredibly modern. Television programming expanded beyond the CBC to include new networks and imported shows from the United States. Shopping started moving from downtown main streets to suburban malls, those climate-controlled wonderlands where you could spend entire Saturday afternoons browsing stores that seemed to stock everything you could ever want. The Eaton's Catalogue still arrived every fall, but it was competing now with other retailers, other options, other ways of finding and buying the things you needed. Your parents started talking about things that hadn't worried them much before: mortgage rates and inflation, energy crises and recession, crime rates in the cities, and whether it was still safe to let kids play outside, unsupervised, until dark. The world was getting bigger and faster and more complicated, even in the suburbs and small towns where most Canadian families were building their lives. The corner stores began facing competition from convenience, store chains, and supermarket giants. Some of the old proprietors retired or passed away, and their children didn't always want to take over the family business. The personal relationships that had defined neighborhood commerce started giving way to efficiency and lower prices, which were good things in many ways, but came with costs that weren't immediately obvious. Television began changing too, offering more choices, but somehow feeling less special. Saturday morning cartoons were joined by weekday afternoon programming, then by cartoon channels that ran animated shows around the clock. The ritual of waiting for Saturday morning, of earning that special time with your siblings, started dissolving into instant availability. You could watch cartoons whenever you wanted, which sounds like progress, but somehow made them less precious, less eagerly anticipated. The 1980s brought new technologies that seemed miraculous at the time. Video cassette recorders meant you could record Hockey Night in Canada and watch it later, or rent movies to watch at home. Cable television expanded your viewing options from 3 or 4 channels to dozens. Personal computers started appearing in some homes, though nobody was quite sure what families would actually do with them. Shopping malls grew bigger and more elaborate, becoming destinations rather than just places to buy things you needed. Music moved from vinyl records to cassette tapes, which meant you could make your own mixtapes and listen to music while you walked around town with a Walkman clipped to your belt. Video game arcades opened in malls and plazas, offering new forms of entertainment that previous generations never could have imagined. But something was being lost in all this progress and convenience. The milk delivery meant you started your day with a small ritual that connected you to your neighborhood and the rhythm of the seasons. When that disappeared, replaced by weekly trips to the grocery store, mornings became a little less special, a little more ordinary. The family telephone attached to the kitchen wall forced everyone to share conversations and coordinate their social lives. When families started getting multiple phone lines and kids got their own phones in their bedrooms, communication became more private, but also more isolated. You could talk to your friends for hours without your parents knowing what you were discussing, which felt like freedom, but also meant losing those moments when the whole family would gather around to hear news or share excitement about a phone call. Playing outside until the streetlights came on required trust between parents and neighbors, a shared understanding that everyone was looking out for everyone else's children. As neighborhoods became less connected and parents became more anxious about safety, kids started spending more time indoors, more time with scheduled activities, less time discovering the world on their own terms. The corner store represented more than just convenient shopping. It was a place where kids learned to interact with adults, count money, make decisions, be part of a community. When those stores were replaced by chain operations with teenage employees who didn't know your name, something important was lost in the transaction. By the time the 1980s were ending and the 1990s beginning, Canada had become a very different country from the one that had hosted Expo 67. More prosperous in many ways, more connected to global culture and commerce, more diverse and cosmopolitan. These were positive changes that opened up opportunities and experiences that previous generations never could have imagined. But the pace of life had accelerated in ways that made the old rhythms seem quaint and outdated. The rituals that had knit communities together, the small daily practices that had made ordinary life feel meaningful and connected, were disappearing or being transformed beyond recognition. This isn't about claiming that everything was better in the past. Those decades had their own problems, their own limitations and injustices. Not every family could afford to save up for a trip to Expo 67. Not every neighborhood was as safe and welcoming as the idealized version we remember. Not every corner store owner was kind and patient with children. But there was something in the texture of daily life during those decades that feels worth remembering, and perhaps worth recovering in new forms adapted to our current circumstances. The idea that some things are worth waiting for, that anticipation can be its own form of pleasure. The notion that community happens through small, repeated interactions, through neighbors knowing each other's names and stories. The understanding that childhood should include unstructured time and unmonitored exploration, space for boredom and discovery and getting dirty and figuring things out on your own. The memories we've been exploring together aren't just nostalgia, though they certainly carry emotional weight for those who lived through them. They're also a record of how human communities can be organized around different values and priorities. The milkman represented a local economy where relationships mattered as much as efficiency. Hockey Night in Canada showed how shared experiences can create national identity and cultural cohesion. The Eaton's Catalogue demonstrated that anticipation and delayed gratification could make ordinary purchases feel special and meaningful. Playing outside until dark required levels of community trust and shared responsibility that seem almost impossible to imagine now. The family telephone forced people to coordinate and communicate in ways that built stronger internal relationships, even as they limited individual privacy. Saturday morning cartoons created shared cultural references and common experiences across an entire generation. Corner stores provided spaces where children could practice being independent while still feeling safe and supported. These weren't just personal memories. They were collective experiences that shaped how millions of Canadians understood themselves, their communities, and their country. They created patterns of living that emphasized patience over speed, relationships over efficiency, community over individual convenience. We can't go back to the Canada of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, nor should we want to. But we can learn from what worked in those decades, from the ways that ordinary life was organized around values that seem worth preserving and adapting for our current circumstances. Maybe that means supporting local businesses that know their customers' names. Maybe it means creating new rituals that bring families and communities together around shared experiences. Maybe it means giving children more unstructured time to explore and discover and figure things out on their own. Maybe it means choosing to wait for things occasionally, to let anticipation build, to experience the pleasure of delayed gratification in a world that offers instant everything. The smell of coffee percolating on the stove, the sound of skates on ice coming through the radio, the weight of the Eaton's Catalogue in your lap, the freedom of summer evenings that seem to last forever. These sensory memories carry more than personal nostalgia. They carry the DNA of a way of life that knew how to find meaning and connection in the smallest daily rituals. If you remember any of these experiences, you're carrying forward something precious, something worth sharing with younger generations who never knew that life could be organized differently. And if these memories are new to you, consider them an invitation to think about what rituals and rhythms might be worth creating or recovering in your own life and community. The Canada we've been exploring together is gone, but the values it embodied, the emphasis on community and patience and shared experience, those can be renewed and reimagined for whatever comes next. Sometimes, the most powerful way forward is to remember clearly and lovingly where we came from, to honor what worked, while adapting it for the world we're building now. And if any part of this sounded like your own childhood, I'd love to hear what you remember most in the comments.